Kina did her best to keep focused as the hours ticked by. Ziza had taken several of her creations and started experimenting on them to see if she could work out any alterations that might work. The young bird noticed that she wasn't much of one for small talk. The days would go by in relative silence, save for the sound of turning pages or the occasional light scrape of metal on metal. The Tinkerer was incredibly focused, and there were times Kina had to blow sharply into her ocarina several times to get her attention. What surprised her the most, though, was that she had been given the offer to stay in her home. As matter of fact as Ziza had been, it still stuck in her mind how tentative she was. It felt almost like she was asking rather than offering. As the days became a week and then kept collecting, Kina had found what it took to unlock Ziza's voice. Between the very direct instructions and the short answers about her past and where she came from, Kina could watch the sparkle in her eyes begin to glow, and a crooked, almost goofy grin would come over the hobgoblin's face whenever she talked about her inventions and devices. She was so excited to share what she made and how it worked, how she figured out how to make it work. There was such passion in the normally severe woman's voice that she almost seemed like an excitable teenager. Her attitude was almost infectious, as she would take things apart and put them back together again right in front of Kina with wondrous pride. It was hard not to be excited when Ziza finally brought out a set of etching tools for Kina to start working alongside her, to start developing a device. I have some ideas based on what I can already make. They'll just need some alterations. Kina elected not to write anything for the moment, simply giving Ziza her full attention and a resonating clack of her beak. An attentive sort might have noticed the way her tail feathers twitched excitedly behind her, like that of a dog. This is something I can make that stores short messages. The hobgoblin pointed to several etched runes on the inside of one of two metal boxes she set down. I noticed that while it does record what I say, depending on how I carve these, it changes my tone slightly. So I want to see what happens when you carve the same ones. Kina blinked and carefully took the box in her hands. She whipped out a second book she'd scrounged up from a dusty cupboard somewhere that she'd been using to keep notes on runes and what they did, and compared what Ziza had written down to the runes she knew. Nodding to herself, she quickly jotted down in her speaking book. So I just redraw the runes on the unmarked box then? She asked, just for clarity. There had been at least one small explosion during her time here, and she was in no rush to be the cause of another. She didn't want to give the guards a valid reason to accost her. Once was bad enough, thank you very much. Yes, just copy them into the blank one. Make sure it's your own handwriting. Don't try to copy mine. Ziza nodded after reading. I'll still have to speak into it, but it'll be a good starting point if it makes a significant difference. Kina nodded, grabbed the offered tools, and set to work. Following Ziza's instructions, she scratched her own handwriting into the side. And as it was in her tome, it came out looking like a chicken had a grudge against the wall of its coop and threw a fit. But the runes were legible, at the very least, so she considered it a job well done. Thank goodness these things don't demand absolute precision, she thought after a few minutes, and pulled back to let Ziza examine her work. Ziza grinned as she picked it up, but it slowly faded and her nose wrinkled, as if something had put a foul smell beneath her nostrils. Maybe I should have started by teaching you calligraphy. Kina pouted and pecked Ziza on the hip. Living up to what Kina had originally thought she was, the hobgoblin jumped and hopped away from the accosting beak, before putting a crystal into a pre-made slot in the handheld device and spoke into it. Kina's voice project, test 1. It was at that moment that Kina and Ziza discovered why it was a bad idea to give a larynx to a box of nails. The resulting scraping and screeching sounds emitted by the box were words, but to call them in any way pleasant would be like saying the abyss was a bit grungy, an understatement of comical proportions. Kina deflated and quickly wrote something down in her book. Reminder, learn calligraphy. She underlined that and made it a point not to show that one to Ziza. Ziza, on the other hand, was smiling. After she had finished smashing the small box with a hammer to get it to stop, she looked up with her eyes sparkling in epiphany. This is good! This is very good! Kina tilted her head and wrote. How? It sounded like a dying parakeet with sand in its beak. Yes, but it proves that we can change a voice with the etchings, Ziza exclaimed, seemingly unaware of Kina's diminished spirits. This is a wondrous breakthrough. Kina clacked her beak. It was a neat discovery, she supposed, but she had to wonder. She returned to her tome. I mean, sure, but, and I'm sorry if this is a dumb question, how does this help with my issue? This seems even less efficient than my book. Ziza seemed almost annoyed that Kina hadn't been as thrilled as she was. The muscles in her jaw clenched and shifted as she ground her teeth, before she let out a sharp hiss of breath and attempted to explain. I realize this may not seem to be what you were hoping for. I'm sure it seems very simple to someone who doesn't know the process. This is not the end goal. What we have confirmed is that we can change an existing voice. This means that we know it's possible to help you. I haven't figured out the rest yet. Kina deflated slightly when she saw Ziza's negative reaction. She quickly jotted down in her book, and when she offered it to Ziza again, she lowered her eyes apologetically. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you. It's just that this means so much to me. I got impatient. I'll try not to be. What's the next step? Ziza sighed, running her hands through her thick black hair as she slid the goggles from her head. I'm not offended. I hoped I had made it clear that this was going to be a long process. On its face, your ask seems simple, but it's complicated. I cannot be one to preach patience, but we are no longer... What is that stupid phrase? Spinning our wheels? Kina nodded along and more solemnly wrote, I guess I just got too excited. When I heard about you and all the cool stuff you create, the idea of getting a voice for myself lit a fire under my tail. I got all twitchy. I know it's not a simple problem to solve, or we would have solved it a long time ago. I'll try to be more patient, I promise. Now, what's the next step? The hobgoblin absently rubbed at her hip as she considered the question. There's a few things. We need to figure out how to make it so that you can speak freely and not depend on pre-recorded statements. She indicated the small box that hadn't been smashed, which coincides with the size issue. So I guess the next step is getting another way to activate it or project immediately. Kina scratched at her beak and thought, then scratched at her neck when a spot just under her beak started itching. After a few seconds, she blinked, her eyes widening slightly. Then she snatched up her book and excitedly jotted down, What about a necklace? Or a choker? Could it be something like that? I could put a finger to it and that turns it on if it needs a manual trigger. She emphasized the idea with a quick doodle of a choker with a round dial at the front, and then presented it to Ziza with a sharp clack of her beak. Ziza slapped a hand onto her workbench, the gleam and the grin returning once more. Yes, this is the energy we need. I think that could work. If we did a choker, we could make it recognize muscle movement in your throat. At worst, there might be a slight delay, but this is a great idea. Kina clapped her hands together and then opened her beak while pointing at her face as if to say, like this? Yes! Ziza was excitedly grabbing a new roll of parchment and quill pens. She slammed her forearm down onto the workbench before scattering everything onto the floor to make space for their new blueprints. Ugh. You could make as if to speak, and the choker would project a voice handwritten by you. What a brilliant girl you are. Kina beamed, clapping her hands again. She quickly added, Could how wide I open my beak correlate to the volume of the projected voice? That way I can yell if I have to, or whisper if I'm keeping secrets from boys. There was a brief blank stare as Ziza froze and considered the thought. Yes, exactly that. If the rest of it works, it should be easy to make it so that you can whisper secrets about boys. If Kenku could have evil smirks, Kina surely got one then. She even rubbed her hands together and chirped out an ominous, crow-like cackling noise. Ziza energetically went to clap Kina on the back, then awkwardly paused several inches from her shoulder, before nodding and leaning over the parchment and scrolling out ideas and equations. The two began to jot down their plans for the next leg of their experiment, eagerly looking forward to the possibilities. It took several days to work out a solution to the first problem, namely the actual size and shape of the choker. If it were just for looks, it would be easy. However, given it was meant to contain an abundance of magical runes and facilitate the birth of a brand new voice, making sure it had all the necessary compartments and avenues for channeling energy was a bit more complicated. Kina was truly beginning to understand the value of measuring twice before cutting once. The first prototype was an ugly, clunky bundle of cubes and hexagons that looked more like something spat out of Mechanus than a piece of jewelry. The primary intention was simply to ensure Kina's concept would actually work in practice. The first test saw them clearing out some space in Ziza's workshop, just in case something happened. It was a little nerve-wracking. The first choker hung heavily from her neck, and the hard edges were abrasive even through the padding of her feathers. She gave Ziza a quick glance, anxiously touching the stone in the centerpiece and waiting for confirmation. Ziza nodded and hunched to stare attentively at the piece as Kina opened her beak. Perhaps it was nervousness, but it seemed like nothing was happening at first, before a low humming began to resonate throughout the room. It increased in volume the wider Kina's beak got, a faint blue glow filling the seams of the metallic parts of the choker. The hobgoblin nodded to her again, indicating Kina should close her beak. The humming went faint again, just as intended. Ziza then motioned with her hand, clapping her thumb and forefingers open and closed. Kina followed the instruction, slowly widening and closing her beak, and with it, the sound rolled out in waves matching her. Excellent! Ziza clapped. How do you feel about it? Kina chirped and scampered over to retrieve her book from a nearby counter before jotting down her response. I love it! But I feel like I have to open my beak a bit too wide to have a normal talking volume. Can we tune it to be a bit more sensitive? I don't want to make my jaw hurt just to say hi to someone, you know? I noticed that, Ziza agreed. It went well otherwise, I think. Hopefully making the size more manageable will increase the sensitivity as well. She unclasped the choker from Kina, setting it down on the workbench before taking out a magnifying glass and motioning for Kina to join her. With the blueprints next to them, they marked spots in the system that they thought might make good areas to improve upon. There were many such experiments like this. Incremental trial and error. Test, revise, design, again and again. Micro-adjustments to circuitry or rune placement, swapping out bits and bobs and various pieces for smaller, more comfortable ones. With every test, the central stone from which the new voice was starting to take form glowed ever brighter. It tingled, too. Almost buzzed. More than once, Kina compared it to having a fly dancing on her Adam's apple, or having a bullseye lantern in her neck. Ziza did not seem to find the humor in those comparisons. But it was exciting all the same. Every step, every day, they made more and more progress. After almost an entire additional week of revisions, tweaks, and small adjustments, the first full prototype was ready to go. A slender, almost elegant choker that looked moderately fashionable fit snugly around Kina's neck. In theory, this would be the one to let her speak her first true word.
So why does Ziza keep looking at her notes?
Kina puffed up her cheeks and walked toward the hobgoblin, who again was scrutinizing her copious notes like a detective trying to solve a murder mystery. She tugged on her sleeve to get her attention and held up her book.
Are we ready?
Kina, I think we should go over this again, Ziza said, as if knowing her friend would not like that response. This is the most complicated thing I have ever worked on. It's best to be sure. Kina clacked her beak and wrote,
Ziza, we've been working on this for over a month. It's complicated, yeah, but I think we've got it. All the other tests have gone fine, and we have this one built already. If it still needs fixing, we won't find out until we test it, right?
This is true, Ziza grimaced. But in this case, I don't think you should be following my example this time. I'd rather test it with something else first. Kina tilted her head when she showed her next response.
Like what? There aren't exactly mini creatures with a problem like mine. It's not like we can stick this choker on a dog and say, speak, and get a result worth anything, can we? Do you even have a dog? I don't think you have a dog.
Ziza conceded, but she still didn't seem happy to do so. No, I don't have a dog. And you're right, it would be incredibly hypocritical of me to deny you to test it on yourself. Just, if anything happens, just be careful. Kina nodded.
I will. Don't worry,
she wrote. But on some level, she had to admit she probably wouldn't be. She was too eager to speak for herself for once. As much as she enjoyed using the book, Ziza hadn't been kidding when she had noted it as inefficient. They probably would have been done a while ago if she could talk at the same speed as someone with a voice. Add to that the fact that she hadn't exactly told her family that she was doing this. Yeah, she was going to be so cosmically grounded when she got home. And so Kina returned to the center of their makeshift testing space and waited for Ziza to give her the go-ahead. With a half-hearted wave and an intense stare at the metal part of the choker, Ziza signaled for the test to begin. Kina nodded and turned a dial in the choker's centerpiece, effectively dubbed the talk switch. There was a sharp and audible click, followed by that same gentle humming as before. The tickle and buzz reverberated through Kina's throat and beak, sending an excited shiver down her spine.
Okay, just remember how it works,
she reminded herself. She imagined it would be some time before she could speak fluently with this thing regardless, as she basically had to teach herself how to make all the different sounds. Vowels, consonants, tone of voice. It would be a learning experience. She opened her beak slowly and felt the humming increase against her. She thought for a few seconds about what to try and say. What should her first word even be? Ziza eyed her carefully, eyes darting back and forth between the young Kenku and their notes. Finally, Kina had an idea. Her eyes lit up, and she went to speak. She tried to say, hello. What came next happened far too quickly for anything to be done about it. As she opened her beak and began to exhale, energy flowed through the choker and into the stone, from which the voice would emerge. It hummed louder, buzzed harder, and it burned. Kina's eyes flew wide, her natural voice joining the artificial one in a yelp of alarm. her clawed fingers rising on reflex to grab at her throat. Her rising voice only accelerated the process, and it burned more. She thought she heard Ziza saying something, but the buzzing was too loud. No, not a buzzing, a crackling. Like a fire. Suddenly, Kina couldn't hear anything through the ringing in her ears. And she couldn't breathe. An agony like fire spread across her throat and upper chest as a powerful force punched her in the windpipe. She toppled back, trying and failing to shriek as something warm and wet spilled down the front of her body. Her vision doubled, blurring and swimming. Noticed black tufts fluttering in the air, and a reddish blur that might have been Ziza kneeling over her. Her throat still burned. It burned so much. She tried to open her beak, no longer caring about her convictions, to scream for help as she had been taught to do in an emergency. But no voice came, only more pain, more burning, more heat.
Make it stop! Make it stop! Make it stop!
And then, it was over. Ziza's hand grabbed the choker and violently tore it away from Kina's neck. At once, the heat was removed, but the pain lingered. Kina's fingers clawed at her neck as finally she was able to suck in a lungful of agonizing air. It burned on the way down, and there was still something wet on her chest. She thought she smelled something burning, like hair and overcooked chicken.
Don't touch it!
Ziza's voice was firm, but strained in a way Kina had not heard before. Her hands reached up again, only to have her wrists grabbed and held away by the hobgoblin's powerful grip. Looking at Ziza, her face was just as focused as always, eyes flickering over Kina as though analyzing her. But when she raised her arm to put it underneath the little bird, it was trembling. With ease, Kina was lifted and placed on one of the many empty workbenches. She let her go very briefly to grab a lantern and a set of magnifying glasses that attached to a headband, before raising a set of forceps and gently lowering it to Kina's neck. The pain grew a little sharper for a second, and there was a tugging sensation, followed by relief. Ziza raised the tool, holding a charred scrap of metal. She tossed it almost violently aside before lowering the forceps again. Kina was starting to feel cold and tired, and she felt her head tilt back, just so she could close her eyes, just for a little bit. "Stay awake!" Ziza's commanding voice was gone, replaced with a desperation she didn't think could come from the same person. "Please, stay awake! You have to!" Kina blinked, and it occurred to her that her eyes were heavier than normal. She lifted a hand to her face, the limb feeling as if it were full of lead. Everything felt sluggish, slow, fuzzy, like she was experiencing the world through a thick, icy blanket. She released a questioning chirp, one of the few vocalizations she allowed herself, and it came out as a grating rasp, like nails on tree bark. Wrong. "You'll be okay. It's fine. You're fine. Everything is fine." Ziza's voice wavered, sounding almost like she was trying to reassure herself as much as she was Kina. "Just pay attention. Listen to me." And for the first time since they had met, Ziza talked. Kina wasn't really sure what she was saying, but the hobgoblin's words kept going in a stream as she worked. When at last she was done pulling shards of metal from Kina's neck, she ripped the headset from her brow and threw it across the room as she hurried to a cabinet. She lathered a thick ointment that had a pungent smell of medicine and aloe onto the wound, before compressing it and gently wrapping Kina's neck with her trembling hands. As the ointment sunk into Kina's skin, the pain began to abate, slightly. She stared up at Ziza, and as her thoughts began to resolve into something coherent, a realization dawned on her.
It didn't work. I almost died, didn't I?
She looked around, having to turn her shoulders with her neck so as not to pull on her newfound injuries, trying to find her tome. She needed to ask. She needed to understand what went wrong and why. Then she noticed Ziza's hand, and fully perceived just how much the hobgoblin was shaking. Kina leaned back, her beak falling open slightly in awe. She had never seen Ziza so genuinely unsettled before. Gingerly, Kina reached out with her hand, the tips of her fingers feeling slightly numb, and curled it around Ziza's. Ziza gently squeezed her hand, steadying herself with a deep inhale from her nose and a long exhale from her mouth. The words that had flowed so freely before seemed to have dried up. It took her a long while before she finally said anything.
I'm sorry.
Kina tilted her head, clicking her beak softly before once more looking for her tome. She tried to sit up, but a firm hand on her shoulder held her steady. Kina gave Ziza an incredulous glance, then mimed rhyming with her empty hands, hoping that would get the message across. The hobgoblin kept a hand pressed onto Kina's shoulder, but reached over to collect the quill and book from the floor. She hesitated as she handed it to the Kenku, but did not withhold it.
Try to keep lying down for now.
Kina nodded, not needing to be told more than that. The tone in Ziza's voice was more than explanation enough. With a trembling hand of her own, Kina wrote,
What went wrong? Am I gonna be okay?
You will be okay. You just need rest. That ointment was used on the battlefield when I was still serving the hobgoblin army. It's better than most potions,
she said with enough confidence to be fairly reassuring. Her posture shifted to one of dejection afterwards.
It wasn't the device or the craftsmanship. It was the power source. Arcane crystals are not meant for things this complex. I'd been hoping it would be enough with the device being so small.
Kina's heart twisted in her chest. She looked around again, and her eyes settled on the shattered remains of the choker, mangled and smoking still on the floor. She shivered and wrote again.
Do we have a bigger crystal? Or a workaround?
Ziza shook her head somberly.
Everything we've done has been a workaround already. The crystals just can't handle it.
Kina's still aching throat got just a little harder to swallow through as a lump began to form. She wrote,
Then what do we do?
We heal,
Ziza said firmly.
That is all we focus on right now.
Kina wanted to press the subject, but she was too tired, and Ziza's tone left no room for argument. And so Kina nodded, setting her tome down and resting her head. But while she was still silent as ever on the outside, on the inside, she was screaming. It was supposed to work. It was supposed to work, damn it! She had come all this way and put in all this effort, been accosted by guards, and now almost got herself killed, and still, she couldn't say a word of her own.
What did my ancestors even do?
She demanded internally, her feathers starting to ruffle in anger.
What could be so bad that this is what we all have to deal with? Where's the justice in this, huh? Is anyone going to answer me?
As ever, they did not. Wishing to scream, but not having the ability, Kina stiffly rose from the workbench, took her tome, and, ignoring Ziza's protests, stormed off for the room Ziza had set aside for her. As Kina walked past a supporting wooden beam, in a rare display of anger, she slashed her avian claws across the wood, leaving deep gouges in the surface and pain in her hand. Ziza watched her go, but found herself bound to silence as surely as the Kenku.